The three types of charging these batteries and the two ways that we're going to use them, right? For energy storage, we've got two of the 100 amp hour 12 volt lithium super packs. These are more of a drop-in battery. They've got an internal BMS, and we have used tin plated copper bus bars to tie those in parallel. We just got heat shrink for protection, and we're utilizing a diagonal wiring arrangement, right? So that's just where we take the positive off of the lead battery, the negative off of the back battery to keep everything balanced. From the batteries on our positive lead, we're going to our main system fuse, a 300 amp A&L fuse, and from there we're going to our main system disconnect. Primarily, we use the main disconnect if we're going to service something in the system and we want to completely shut off the battery power, if we got to swap out the battery or something like that, or if we need to swap out a component. And on the negative side, we're going to the smart shunt that is Bluetooth capable. You've got a few different options when it comes to shunts. Basically, this is just going to monitor everything that comes into the batteries and everything that comes out to give you that accurate state of charge. So from there, we hit our Lynx distributor. Sir?
Sorry, quick question for you. How important is it to keep the links of the wires coming off the battery similar, the same?
If you are combining batteries at a bus bar, it's very important. Yep, you want to ensure that each string coming from each battery is the exact same length, and that will keep things balanced, right? Because if they're different lengths, you're going to have less resistance with some of them, and so you'll be pulling from some batteries more so than the others, and it'll be harder to keep all those cells balanced.
Which is not in this system.
Right, yeah, that's not relevant in this system, but if you've got a series of batteries and the leads are going from each battery and combining at a bus bar, in that case you want to ensure that each battery has the same length leads coming from them to the bus bar. So some that are closer might be a little bit longer than they really need to be, but that's just to ensure that everything stays balanced.
Thank you.
Sure. So from there we come to the Lynx distributor. This is basically, a positive bus bar and a negative bus bar all in one tight compact package. It's got locations for these mega fuses. Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to get in there. And so this is going to be the main system, main DC distribution for all of your main DC components, right? The inverter charger is connected here. The DC to DC charger, which we use for alternator charging, that's connected here, as well as the MPPT and the DC output. This has 4 slots, but it's modular. So basically these bars here, if you get a second one of these units, would tie into these bolts here, and you can just kind of extend it down to as many to have as many points as needed for your system. Here's the case for it, and it's pretty neat. This is actually installed upside down, right? But this comes with stickers that you can kind of put the sticker there and ensure that the letters are right side up. If you're installing a Victron system with primarily Victron components, you're probably going to be a little more thoughtful with your installation, and having the letters facing the right way can be a nice touch, right?
That's handy for shows.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really insightful and just a nice thought.
Yeah.
It's awesome. Yeah. I got one and I'm like, oh, that makes sense. And guess
Right.
what? I needed to install it in the direction that's going to put them on.
Nice, perfect. And then we've got these. These are actually going to be lights. This power light is going to be green, but it's only going to work if you've got a Lynx shunt as well. There's a workaround where you can install a little DC converter to power that 5-volt light to make it work without the Lynx shunt. And these lights here will be blank unless you blow a fuse, in which case they'll light up red, and that'll notify you that, hey, this string, the fuse is blown, you need to replace that, right? And with the Lynx shunt, that can actually communicate that to the Cerbo, so you can see which fuse is blown. And that can help out if you're trying to, you know, troubleshoot something remotely or something of that nature. It can kind of assist you in that. You can put more leads than 4 on here, right? You just want to make sure they're all fused. So we've got the lead from our Cerbo and the lead from our smart shunt. Those are coming in here as well on top of the fuses that we've got in place here, right? The negative, those sit underneath. They're kind of buried right now, hidden. On top of that is the positive lead going to all of our components, and that has a fuse bridging this main bus bar where the battery is coming in. So when you place these extra wires on here from the Cerbo or the smart shunt or whatever it might be, you'll want to place them on top of the fuse on the actual bus bar itself, so that if this fuse happens to blow, it's not also affecting your other component, right?
Then that wire's not fused though.
Say again?
Then the wire's not fused.
Well, it is, right? You're going to want to make sure that there is a fuse on the wire itself.
Not by the same one or the other one.
Not by the same fuse, because this is a different size wire as well, so it wouldn't be properly fused with something this large anyways. So yes, you'll certainly want to make sure that there is a fuse on any wire in the system, and if you're doing it this way, then ensure that there's a fuse after the fact. DC to DC charger, this is an isolated. There's non-isolated models as well. With the non-isolated, instead of having 2 positives and 2 negatives, you'll have 2 positives and a shared negative, right? And typically you'll use a non-isolated if you're working on a bus or a van or a motorhome. It's not a trailer, right? Like if using an isolated, you want to do that primarily if you've got different chassis grounds, and you'll just use an Anderson connector. I'll show you that. You can actually get eyes on it, and you'll bring the chassis ground from the vehicle where the alternator power is coming in, as well as the positive, to that Anderson connector, and that will be the input on your isolated charger, and then your output, you'll have a positive and a negative as well going to your Lynx distributor.
So just to make sure I heard that, so like for a Class A RV that you drive, you would want a non-isolated.
You could use a non-isolated.
That would be the norm.
Exactly.
Unless somebody changed something somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You could use a non-isolated.
I wasn't sure about that.
And you can use these in parallel as well. 30, 60, 90. You can put, I think, up to 6 of them in parallel. Typically, we haven't done any more than 3, and that's going to really be determined by the size of your alternator as well. You don't want to overtax that, so make sure to keep that in mind when deciding how much to go with. We typically err on the side of caution with how much to pull from a primary alternator, because the last thing you want is to burn out your alternator prematurely and then be left stranded somewhere.
And you do have to connect a pretty large wire all the way back to the alternator for that.
Yeah. Even for this 30 amp, it's recommended 6 gauge. And as you go larger, you will need to increase the wire size. That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is the Multiplus Compact. A little bit smaller, different footprint than the 3000. This is the 2000 VA. And yeah, that's our inverter charger. We've got charging the batteries when you plug into shore power, or if you plug a generator onto the shore power port of your RV, this will take that AC and it will convert it into DC to charge your batteries. It's also got a pass-through automatic transfer switch built in, so it will prioritize AC loads, and it'll pass, the shore power will pass right through this inverter to take on those AC loads, whatever it is that you might be running, and any extra power you got on shore power is going to go towards charging your batteries. And this also has power assist, right? So if when you're plugged into shore power, before you do so, you're going to want to adjust the current limit, and that's going to be dependent on whatever service it is that you're plugging into. So if you're on a 15 amp service, you'll adjust that current limit to 15 amps. 30 amps, you'll go up, and that's to ensure that you don't trip the breaker, because if you try to pull more than 15 amps, then the breaker on the post is going to trip, and you're going to have to deal with that. But if you've got it set to 15 amps and you want to use more than that, the Multiplus can assist with providing more power. So we'll move on to the MPPT. We're using a 130 smart solar, Bluetooth capable, so you can go in there and see exactly what's happening. That also connects to our Cerbo, so you can look at the PV charger there and see exactly what's coming in. When sizing an MPPT, it's really important to pay attention to a couple factors, right? This is the 130. That 100 is the maximum voltage that can come into this charge controller. If you go any higher than that 100 volts, you're going to damage it, right? So you want to make sure that when you're sizing your system, that you stay below that 100 volt threshold, and you want to take into account temperature as well, because colder temperature can actually increase the voltage of your array. So there's a MPPT calculator on the Victron site. Highly recommend checking that out. You can put in a custom module with all the specifications of the panel that you're looking at and how you plan to arrange them, series, parallel, and that will determine the optimal charge controller for your application.
It's a percent voltage variance that you can see.
Percent voltage variance.
Yeah, you said the voltage increase.
Yeah, it can go. You know, depends on the array and the temperature, but you can see 10, 15 volt increase in very cold temperatures. You can see that easily. Yeah. Now, another thing you're going to want to think about is the battery bank voltage. So if you this 130 is rated for 440 watts with a 12 volt system, right? But if you have and by 12 volt system I mean 12 volt battery bank. But if you have a 24 volt battery bank, this same charge controller is rated for 880 watts, right? So you get a lot more bang for your buck with these charge controllers as you go up in voltage with your battery bank.
Oh, so those are the 12 volt base numbers, and if you just happen to have a 24 volt, then what's being fed on that is...
Well, this is a 130. 100 voltage.
That's the inside.
100
That's
voltage
amps.
remains the same in terms of
With
the
the volts
max
and the
amount that
amps.
can come in terms of voltage. The 30 is the amps that can come out of this MPPT, and that's 30 amps at 12 volts
I got it.
or 24 volts, right? And there's MPPTs that are capable with 48 volts as well.
So if you set up your array to stay, for example, to stay within your volts, right? And then obviously your wires for your amps, and you happen to have a 24 volt battery bank, you're gonna scale up on the amps from that to your battery bank.
Yes, and you're gonna
Scale up on the
reduce.
watts. The amps stay the same, essentially. The 30 amp is
You'll stay the same on the watts, yes.
no.
Oh,
The amps stay the same. The volts go up,
And so you double
and so you
the
get more
watts.
watts.
Right.
Volts times amps
Yes,
is watts.
yes.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
exactly.
yeah.
And another thing you'll want to consider with these when you're sizing your system and when you're determining your battery bank voltage and the solar array voltage, whether you want to wire them in series to increase the voltage of your panels, or if you want to wire them all in parallel, you'll want to look at what the voltage of your solar array is relative to the voltage of your battery bank. So in order for these to even turn on, it's got to be, the solar array has to be 5 volts above your battery bank voltage. And you see issues with this in smaller systems where you've got a single 12 volt panel up there that produces anywhere from 18 to 20 volts once it's getting hit with solid sun. But if you've got a lithium battery that rests at a higher voltage, and you've only got that single panel up there, or you've got a couple of them in parallel, right, and you're not producing very much in terms of voltage, then you can have issues with charging in very cloudy circumstances or early in the morning. So one more thing to keep in mind, 5 volts is the minimum. 20 volts and up is kind of ideal, right? If you're 20 volts or above with your solar array relative to your battery bank, then that's going to enable your charge controller to work as efficiently as it can.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Once you're past those thresholds to make sure you're harvesting, and it's going through, what are the trade-offs to parallel or series on your solar panels?
So a couple of things to consider are keeping the wire gauge within that 10 gauge in order for the MC4, because it's hard to find an MC4 connector that's capable of taking an 8 gauge. Typically they're all designed for like 10 gauge, or there's some 12 gauge as well. So trying to keep the maximum amperage below 30 is typically a good idea, and you can do that by being
Do your math.
Yeah, doing the math.
Sorry.
And really looking at how you can combine some panels in series.
Right.
Sometimes if you got a larger array, you might do a series parallel arrangement where you're utilizing both. Now, one thing you do want to keep in mind with connecting panels in series is that if one panel in that series string is shaded, that's going to affect all of the panels in that series string. So if you anticipate being in partial shade, or if sometimes the AC units on these rigs can, if they're very close to the panel, the way the sun hits it, that'll cast some shade onto your panel, and even a small amount of shade can make a pretty big impact on the performance of the array. You'll just want to look at the panel that you're considering, look at the specifications of it, and see if it falls in a higher voltage so you can wire them in parallel, or if it falls in a lower voltage but it's the only panel that really seems to fit, or the panel that you're kind of sold on, then you might want to consider running them in series to get that higher voltage. More power, generator power, turning that into DC to charge the batteries, or our MPPT coming in from solar. We're also going to have a DC output, obviously, for all of our 12-volt loads, LEDs, water pumps, stuff of that nature. And that's coming from our Lynx distributor, main DC distribution point. And that's going, the output is going to our battery protect. And that's going to lead to all of our 12-volt loads. And this battery protect serves two functions. You can program a low voltage threshold similar to how you can do with the Multiplus, so that all of your DC loads disconnect in the event that your batteries drop below a certain threshold. And you can also be used as a DC disconnect switch, right? So if you're putting your rig in storage or something like that, you can either use Bluetooth to switch that contact, or you can wire in a switch right here where you see this jumper. You can tap into the H pin here and wire that into an inline switch, and then you can have that anywhere that's convenient to turn off all DC loads whenever you want. It's maybe the smart battery protect.
How many amps is that rated for?
This is a 65 amps. In the trailer, we've got a few of them lined up. We've got a 65 amp, a 100 amp, and a 220 amp.
Amperage outputs, right? The dependent is the large and the extra large are going to have communication built in. So there's a Phoenix connector, relay outputs, and CAN bus on those, depending on the unit, right? So if you don't go with a large and an extra large, because it's not necessarily necessary in every application, right? If you go with a small or a medium format, then adding in a battery protect on the output side of that to be able to turn off that charge, because you don't have that connection built in, is really important. So what's this, a 130? So the 130 does not have a connection on it, whereas the 250 100s, the 150 100s do. So theoretically, this should have a battery protect on the output side coming out, right? So you can control that and turn off the charge based on overcharging or under temperature.
Now that's in the event of a battery with an external BMS, right? With an internal BMS, it's not as much of a concern to be able to trigger that charge disconnect. So with these batteries in here, it actually has the jumper, and it's the same as what we see, right here, right? How we can control this with another switch. Well, with an external BMS, it has a charge disconnect port that you run that to your various charge sources to ensure that those disconnect in the event of over voltage or high temperature, low temperature. These are things that you want to protect the battery from. The internal BMS, all that protection is kind of built in, so it's almost bulletproof. But with an external BMS, you want to make sure that you've got that charge disconnect run to your various sources. And what Sam's getting at is if you've got a smaller MPPT with smart lithium batteries that require an external BMS, you're going to want to wire in a battery protect with that charge disconnect run to that battery protect so it can switch off the output of the MPPT in the event of a situation where the BMS deems, hey, we don't want any charge, right? Low temperature, over voltage, something like that.
There can
This
be.
is where I get lost in option A, option B, option C.
Yeah, and well, this is where it comes into like, you know, an average installer up to like an expert installer. What makes an expert installer is taking into account all of these different variables. Because Kaz is right. You technically don't need that disconnect if you have a disconnect in the battery, but internal BMS batteries can be incredibly temperamental, right? And so they're not always known to reconnect in terms of that contact. So sometimes you have issues with that. So if you got into complex system design or you wanted a failsafe, you could add in battery protects at a relatively low cost, right? I mean, the 65 amp is about $60 for the Bluetooth version to perform that disconnect before the internals of your battery and give you more control, and it would mean that it would limit some of the annoyances of having an internal battery contact disconnect and not be able to reconnect.
But the battery would need a communication, right?
No, because you can do it off of programming. So you don't have to have the internal BMS communicate with the rest of the system. You could turn that off based on state of charge, based on voltage, either through programming or through a relay from the BMS.
And you could use a smart battery sense for the temperature.
Correct.
Right.
Really, we're only talking hundreds of dollars in variance, not over thousands of dollars, right? Between option A, option B. But what's the most stable? Right? What's the best kind of solution?
I think we both like external BMS systems. You have more control, you know, you have more capability, and the footprint, you know, you've got more options in terms of batteries that you can choose from. The design is a little more complex in the sense that you've got an external BMS, right? So now from that you're running both load disconnects and charge disconnects. So it's on you to make sure that you're really protecting that battery, because if it's not wired properly, then it's a lot easier to damage the battery, an external BMS battery. But in terms of the ability to do more and get more out of it, external BMS batteries will provide you with the most capability. Yeah.
It is significantly more expensive though. I would say
For
significantly.
the battery side.
Not for the battery side, just the system in general, because you've got to add in all those protects, and if you're paying someone to do that as well, that's going to be more labor. But the longevity and the performance of your system is going to far exceed. It's not comparing apples to apples.
Yeah.
It's really it's a different ballgame in the same sense that comparing like a smart lithium battery from Victron or MG or Pylon-Tech or any of these top quality manufacturers, it's not comparing apples to apples when you line it up next to a battle one. It's
Right.
just like a vastly different.
Right.
It's not well communicated out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's not
just
well
as
communicated.
feedback to the company, making the case on a broader scale, because there's certain ones that are.
I mean, they
I'm
don't
just
really.
saying.
Yeah, they don't really mind because they're selling batteries out the door.
So smart lithium is going to use an external BMS, right? Like we talked about, that's going to require a load disconnect and a charge disconnect going to your various loads and chargers. We're using the VE bus BMS. We typically recommend that if you've got an inverter charger in the system. That BMS, it's going to communicate directly to the inverter charger with an RJ45 through that VE bus communication. And the rest of the charge and load disconnects are going to come from the actual BMS box itself. And that's mounted on the other side of the rig. We'll step over to that side here shortly, and so you can actually get eyes on that. We're using two 200 amp hour batteries at 24 volts, equivalent to 800 amp hours at 12 volts, right? Those are going into the Lynx shunt and 2 Lynx distributors. Remember, these only have 4 slots, so if you've got multiple MPPTs, multiple charge controllers, you might need to use a second distributor in your system. Now we've got 2,000 watts of solar on the roof. 800 watts are flex panels that come from Sunflare, and the other 1,200 are rigid panels that come from Rich Solar. We went with those different options, one to kind of showcase the different options that you got when it comes to doing these installations. There's a lot of them out there, and also to kind of compare the performance of the flex panels versus the rigid panels, and so far they're holding up really good. Now, typically we don't recommend flex panels unless it's like absolutely necessary, and that's because they typically don't last as long as rigid panels, and they heat up faster. They're going to be mounted directly to the roof, and so rigid panels, they're on mounts and are elevated from the roof, so they get airflow, and the roof itself isn't heating up the panel. Some flex panels are more durable than others, so you want to make sure if you're using a flex panel as a deployable solution, you want to check with the manufacturer, see if they recommend that, or if they recommend certain safeties in terms of how you transport it, how you store it, so that you don't get micro fractures in the cells. It's something you want to be careful with if using a flex panel as a deployable solution. But yeah, we so far they've been performing really well, and we've actually seen over 2,000 watts come in to the charge controllers. It's really rare, right? This is a perfect situation. You got peak sunlight, it's nice and cool, you got a couple double rainbows in the sky. At that point you might get
It's all unicorn.
2,000 or 2,000 plus, but you typically don't expect that. You can expect anywhere from 70 to 80% of what your solar array is rated for in peak sunlight conditions. So those solar arrays both of them are coming into this this disconnect. Okay, and so this is a positive and negative disconnect for each array, and
Mechanical?
yeah, and that way we can isolate the solar array in the event that we need to service anything, or sometimes you might, if your batteries drop below their threshold and completely shut off, then there's a chance that the charge controller might need to be reset, kind of cycled, so that it'll show up on Bluetooth. Instances like that, it's really good to have a disconnect there. And both of those lead into our charge controllers. And so we've got two charge controllers. Each array has its own charge controller. And so you're not really going to want to mix voltages or different panels when you're with a single MPPT. You're going to want dedicated MPPTs for that.
But there's no problem paralleling the MPPTs on the same battery bank?
No problem. Paralleling the output of the MPPTs, yeah. Yep, that's not an issue. And that's what we've done on our Lynx distributor. That's basically what's happening. These are being paralleled in that Lynx distributor.
Yeah, even down the line, there's still one set of batteries in it. It would, okay. Not all of
But
them.
those talk to each other, right? Those two solar
They
charge
do, and you
controllers.
can,
So that statement about paralleling them, does that apply to other brands, or is that not a problem just for Victron because they talk to each
Well,
other?
when we're talking about paralleling, all we're saying is that the output from each MPPT
Yeah.
is going to the battery bank.
The
So we do
batteries.
program each of these individually for the parameters that we want, but then you can smart network them. You can create a network and allow them to communicate with each other, so that when you're looking at this PV charger here, it tells you the total that your array is producing instead of one or the other.
To carry that whole thought further, you could use a 130 and a 150 at the same time.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the solar coming in. That's one source of charge, and then we've got our inverter chargers. Now we're using multiple units here in split phase. This is a 50 amp coach, and so one of the units is providing line 1 to the breaker panel, and the other unit is providing line 2.
Do you have any 240 volt loads in this coach?
We don't. No. Nope.
And is that capable of handling a 240 volt load? Working together.
Yes, in a split phase, right? Exactly. Yeah, and so, if you've got an RV that has like a washer dryer or something like that, sometimes there are 240 loads in some of the larger coaches. But yeah, this one we don't have any other 240 requirements.
Like a heat pump.
When you're coming in with a 30 amp shore power, which inverters do you have here, and how does it handle that?
So 30 amp would be providing power to the master, right, the primary, and that would pass through and provide power to, say, the one side, line 1 of your panel, and then line 2 will be powered solely from the other inverter. And so no shore power would be involved in that, but the second inverter would allow you to have both sides of your panel continuously lit up. Because if you only had one inverter, then unless you had the Multiplus 2, right, that has
Which
the
is
option.
12 volt only at this point.
It is.
Do you know when 24 is
Hopefully soon.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
you saw where I was going.
Run that one to Rich. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That's another one that he needs to hear. I told the other group this. I'll tell it
Because this is
to
a
you guys as
24
well.
volt.
Yes.
Okay, yeah,
It is.
yeah,
And
okay.
so I'll tell it to you guys as well. Any of these products that you'd like to see come out, make sure that Rich, you guys know Rich, he's got the white hair, he was in there giving the
He's
intro.
doing the data.
So he's the one that, works for Victron, and so making sure that he hears these things will kind of maybe even speed it up a little bit for all of us, right?
Thank you. Sorry to inject.
Sure.
my
No, you're good. So that's the inverter chargers. For alternator charging, we're using a 100 amp buck boost, and that's taking power from the vehicle, and it's transferring it through to charge our batteries through that 100 amp buck boost, fully programmable, 12, 24 volt applications.
So you have an ANS connector or whatever that goes back to the truck.
Yeah, we've got an Anderson connector. We'll take a look at that here in one moment. One more thing I want to touch on this side is the 24 to 12 Orion. And this is going to be necessary if you got a 24 volt battery bank and you're trying to power 12 volt loads like most RVs have, right? LED lights, water pumps, stuff of that nature. This 2412 is 70 amp DC to DC converter. So you can program the output. It's got a little bit of a range, but right now we've got it set at about 13.2. So it always just provides a steady 13.2 output.
So that's good for 24 volt coaches. Putting a 12 volt.
If you've got a 24 volt battery bank and you want to power all of your 12 volt
Right.
loads, then you're going to need this 24 to 12
Trevos and
converter.
MCIs, okay, yeah, they're 24 volt. Huh.
NMEA 2000 stuff here. Curious where that's going.
So that dude, he knows technical stuff.
Oh, that's a Garmin. Like a boat use thing there. Look at
I
that.
thought those looked like.
So if it reaches a charge or a discharge condition, disconnect condition, it will relay that to the BMS, which will then relay that to our Multiplus with this RJ45 cable here, and then to our different load and charge sources, like we talked about over there, whether it be the MPPT, the 2412 Orion, that will run a load disconnect directly to that. So in the event that those batteries reach low voltage, it will trigger the contact inside of that 2412 converter, and that'll be your main DC disconnect.
You get to hear the cost of these things.
Pretty competitive. I think the 24 volt 200 amp hour batteries run right around 36 or 3700.
So
And
$900 per 100
per thousand.
per thousand.
Per kilowatt or per 1,000
kilowatts.
watts.
For 100
Per 100 amp hours, yeah.
Yeah.
Amp hours,
See some NMEA 2000 stuff down here, and they're disappearing over to the other side of the panel, and I see some stuff going on here. So can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, this is the marine integration here, and so this will. There's an adapter, a Victron adapter, that will allow the Cerbo to interface with NMEA, and yeah, it allows you to monitor and control your system using an MFD, and there's a few of them that are supported. This is one of them here, the Garmin. But yeah, that's basically what that is demonstrating.
So those are going off to the front there. What are those hooking to?
Yeah, you've got one. Both of these are going to the. If we come around here, the VE bus, the VE bus communication port, and that's just running through a splitter going back there.
So is this the other end of that CAN bus right there that came off the?
Yeah, that's the other end right there. Yep.
So is that? I mean, it looks like Ethernet to me,
And
but
that's
it's
VE. That's VE Can, and so yeah, that's the VE
Yeah,
Can
what a fool
communication,
me,
not
I'm like-
VE bus.
It just looks like a little switch.
so the VE can plug essentially directly into the NMEA 2000 stuff.
Right. Yeah, because that is.
Looks like it's just an adapter cable.
Because the adapter, this is a VE Can adapter. The other side of this is going directly into the NMEA, and so it's only so long, right? So you'll need an extension.
So is the protocol under the hood the same as NMEA 2000? It's just the cabling connectors are different? Is that what's going on here?
Right. I'm pretty sure that's a really good one for Rich to get real deep into the weeds with you. But yeah, basically they have enabled the Cerbo to interface with the NMEA protocol so that you can have that functionality on your MFD.
Yeah, I'm going to grill him about that over there.
Yeah.
This is a cart that's demonstrating our Cerbo GX, which is kind of the information hub of our systems. We're going to go over what the hardware features are on it, and also how you can use it in your applications or in your customers' applications for remote monitoring and other functionalities. So as I mentioned before, I was talking to a few of you, Victron's got a bunch of different communication protocols. Our goal is to try and be sort of a systems solution for AC and DC systems. So instead of providing one product that you can use in an application, you have to go to another company to find another product. We want to make sure that we have a component that does something for every part of the system. So that's why we have inverter chargers and batteries and battery monitors, solar charge controllers, transformers if need be. The point is, if you have all these different products, they've all been developed over time. They all use slightly different protocols in terms of the communication that they're talking. And that's due to a variety of reasons. One can be the age in which they were developed. It can be the cost of the communication protocol hardware that's needed, and it can also be the usage of the product itself. But in short, we have three basic protocols that we use. One is called VE Bus, and that's the protocol that the inverter chargers use to talk to each other. So if you're putting them in parallel or in split phase or three phase, it allows AC and DC data to be shared in a format that they all can read very, very quickly and can respond to very quickly. Other products like the solar charge controllers and the battery monitors use VE Direct, which is a cost-effective serial protocol. And the main reason we use that for inverter chargers is because it is very cost-effective. It's an inexpensive way to get all the data that you need, and it allows the products to be sold at a reasonable price. If we were to put full CAN bus capability in like a small smart battery monitor, it would end up being at least half or twice the cost to us. So we try to factor in the price point that we're going for, also with the capability. So out of these three different protocols, we want to have the ability to connect them all to one device so that everything can be seen kind of in one quick overview. And that's where we have the Cerbo GX. The Cerbo GX is kind of the second generation of products. The original one that we had was called the color control panel, which was a small screen, very similar to this, that had a little set of buttons on the bottom that allowed you to go through screens and monitor devices. This next generation, the Cerbo, is a much faster processor. It can handle more devices and it can do a lot more things for your system. First of all, it's got a couple of VE bus ports on it that allow you to connect your inverter chargers to. Now, whether you have one inverter charger in your system or whether you have two in parallel or three in three-phase, that's all considered one VE bus system. So that's going to connect with one Cat5 cable to a VE bus port. We also have two VE Can ports on there, and VE Can uses the same type of cable. It's a Cat5 cable. That can be daisy chained among many different products. Up to 25 different products can be connected on the VE Can port. So you simply run the Cat5 cable between each product. They don't have to be the same product. They can be a battery monitor and a solar charge controller and a standalone battery charger. No matter how many you have, you run them together, and in the end, you're going to have one cable in here and one cable coming from the daisy chain products. And also on that network, there's going to be two open ports, one on each side. And those, for the VE Can, you want to put in a resistor. And all of the products that are VE Can enabled have a little tiny blue terminating resistor that you kind of pop in. It has the same plug end as a Cat5 cable or RJ45 plug. You just pop it in, and that sets the communication level, voltage level, and resistance for the CAN bus. We also have three VE Direct ports on there. So you could have three individual VE Direct devices connected with a VE Direct cable, which again is a simple 4-wire cable with a specific type of plug on each end. The plug itself is not proprietary, but if you want to know what it is, you can look up our documentation online and it shows you the exact name and type of plug. We also have some USB ports on there. If the Cerbo has the ability to handle up to 15 VE Direct devices independent of each other. And since there's only 3 VE Direct ports on there, one of the ways you can expand that connectivity is to use VE Direct to USB converter cables. And you can run those into a powered USB hub, like you can get at any Staples or Best Buy, and then run one USB cable back to the USB port. And the Cerbo is able to differentiate between the products that are connected. It will know that you have 2 MPPTs on there, or it'll know that you have 10 different charge controllers on there, and they'll all show up in your product list. So that's kind of the communication on the Victron information side. Now, the question is, once you're all connected, how do you work with that information and what can you do with it? The simplest way to interface with that is to use one of the optional Touch 50 or Touch 70 screens. And that just connects to the Cerbo with an HDMI cable, and it's got a USB power cable on it as well. And it allows you to go through the menus of the Cerbo. You can go into each line item of whatever's connected to the device, and whatever's connected, you can get further into it by just clicking on that line item. And there'll be a bunch of options, so it's just like a menu tree. Whatever's on this device list is entirely dependent upon what you have connected to it. If you've only got a single battery monitor connected to it, well, that's the only thing you're going to see on there. If you have a bunch of inverter charger system, a bunch of solar charge controllers, each one of those will have its own line item in the device list. The overview screen is meant to give you a quick one-glance look at what's happening in your system. So in this particular case, this is assuming that there's a inverter charger in the system in the center that's off. It's not really the case, but it's for demonstration purposes. So it'll give you information on AC input, what's coming in from the grid or generator, what your loads are doing. There's a little battery screen that shows you state of charge of your batteries, what the voltage in amps going into or out of the batteries. If there were solar connected to this, you would see a little icon for solar, and it would tell you whether it was a DC solar source, like an MPPT, or whether it was an AC coupled PV inverter, which we can work with Fronius and ABB and Solar Edge and all of the larger PV inverter companies. They'll also display on here. So this gives you a quick glance. You'll know exactly what's coming in and out of your system at any one moment. And that's kind of the simplest way to interface with the Cerbo. Now, you don't need to have one of these devices in your system if you don't want to. This is certainly nice because it's waterproof and it's a touch screen, and you can mount it, you know, not even just within the length of this cable. You can also extend this cable by 10 or 15 meters or so if you have a high quality HDMI cable, and you can power the screen up with 5 volts no matter where you're mounting it. If you didn't have this connected, the Cerbo has got a built-in Wi-Fi transceiver. So it's not just a Wi-Fi device that's looking to capture the Wi-Fi signal that's generated somewhere else in the area. It also sends out a Wi-Fi signal that you can connect to with your phone. So if you wanted to, and you didn't have a Touch 50 screen, the way to access this would be to simply go to your phone settings, go to your Wi-Fi net settings. You'll see the name of this device as a connectable Wi-Fi signal. It'll set Venus, which is the name of the operating system that we use, and then it'll have the serial number of the device. So you click on that, and you enter a key, which is found on a sticker on here, and you can log into that directly on its own Wi-Fi signal. And you'll end up getting the same screen that you see here, this overview screen, and this device menu as you go in on your phone. So, or your tablet, or whatever device you're using to connect to that Wi-Fi signal. You can do it with a desktop if you're in the vicinity. And that's certainly a fine way to do it. The Wi-Fi sender on this thing is not terribly strong. You know, you can probably be good within a 6-foot radius or a 10-foot radius, which in some applications is perfectly fine. If you want to have a larger area of connectivity and you still are using your phone, you can log into this device and connect it to a greater Wi-Fi network. And the way you do that is that this also has a Bluetooth transmitter on it. So you would open up the Victron Connect app, which, Ro, you familiar with Victron Connect? It's the app that you can download that allows you to connect to things like the smart solar charge controllers via Bluetooth, or the smart shunt via Bluetooth. And you can do readings from them, you can do setting changes, all via the Bluetooth connection. For the Cerbo, there's also a Bluetooth connection, but it is simply for setting up the network connections. So if I were to open up the Victron Connect app, which there's a version for Apple or iPhones, there's a version for Android phones, and a version for Windows, and a version for Mac. Well, this is going to show you a lot of different stuff that's in the area because we have all this equipment around here. But one of the things it will show is a Cerbo somewhere along there. So here's a Cerbo right here. It might be this one, it might be the one on the back. But in any case, it's going to pop up in a list of connectable devices. So if you just have the Bluetooth going, you can connect on that. It'll open up the network connections for the Cerbo. And you can tell that Cerbo to connect to, say, like the AM Solar guest Wi-Fi account. And you can enter in you find the account as it pops up, and then enter the password in. There's a menu for that. Once you have this connected to the Wi-Fi network, then if that Wi-Fi network is connected to the internet, you can connect to this device no matter where you are in the world that also has internet connection. You can log into this device through the internet. Again, that's with your phone, your tablet, desktop, laptop, whatever you want to do. Even if that router didn't have internet connectivity, you can still log into this device within the vicinity of that Wi-Fi transceiver that's in that router. You don't have to be connected to the internet in order to access the Cerbo. You can be on what's called a local area network, or LAN. And there's a way to connect to this called remote console over LAN. The advantage to doing that is that, as I mentioned, this has got a somewhat small vicinity radius of signal for connecting locally. If you connected to that one and it didn't have internet, you might have a much wider area to connect to it. So if you have an RV and you don't care about connecting to the internet, but you still want to wirelessly connect to your Cerbo system, you can just get a Wi-Fi router connect the Cerbo to the Wi-Fi router, and then the range of that Wi-Fi router would be wide enough for you to connect. But of course, if it's connected to the internet, you've got the entire world to access your device. So once you're connected to the internet, you have the option of using what we call the VRM portal. And this is an example of the VRM portal for this particular Cerbo. The Cerbo is taking all the Victron related data and it's uploading it to a secure server that we house at headquarters in the Netherlands. You have your own login and password for your own system, your own Cerbo, that you will be able to log into and see what's happening with your system. Each Cerbo has got a unique portal ID number that's assigned to it. And when the Cerbo is connected to the internet, it's going to seek out the server that we have in the Netherlands. In order to create that connection, you have to log in on the Victron Energy website, and you can go to the VRM portal menu, and it will ask you, do you want to set up a VRM system? In that case, you enter your email address or the email address of whoever you want to have access to this device, and you enter the portal ID number, and it will allow communication to establish between the server and the Cerbo. This will start uploading data of Victron equipment at intervals of your choosing. You can have it as fine as almost real time, meaning as soon as some sort of value has changed, it'll send data to the VRM portal, and that's what it's doing right now with this real time. Or you can, if you want to use somewhat less data, you can set the intervals to something further apart, like once every 15 minutes or once every hour. If you just want to be able to get alarms notifications, you can set it to something even finer than that, or less fine than that. In any case, it's going to upload that data to the portal, and it's going to display it at first on this overview screen. And this overview screen, as you can kind of tell, looks very similar to the one that's on the local panel. It gives you the same information, what's coming in, what's going out, what your batteries are doing, what your other DC loads are in the system. It also will show information of other equipment that's connected to the Cerbo. In this case, we have some resistive tank senders that are connected to the Cerbo. We also have some extra temperature sensors that are connected to the Cerbo. And this will also display on your VRM portal. The other option you can do with this is that since you are connected to the internet, you have what's called remote console. So remote console, again, is basically a mirror of what you're seeing on what you would see on the local screen. So this TV that you see here, it happens to be 6 inches away from this Cerbo, but it's actually going, the Cerbo is connected to the internet, to a computer, which is then being displayed onto this particular TV as a monitor. So this could be 6,000 miles away, and you're seeing the same thing that you're seeing on the screen on there. And you would have the same overview options. You can go into the device menu. And see all the connected different devices that are on there. The other thing you can do is you can go to the Events tab. What the Events tab does is it takes all the sets of data that are being uploaded to the website and puts them in graphical form based upon a time scale. This one happens to show grabs of information over the last 7 days. So you can kind of see there's a relay that's in the system, and that has been activated for a certain amount of time in the last couple of days. There's a water tank level that shows the level of that tank in the last day or 2 days. You can choose which bits of data you want to see on the VRM portal by choosing widgets. Widgets will display all the possible data that you might be able to see, and allows you to select just which ones are available. Each device has its own set of data has the ability to send. For instance, an inverter charger can send AC input data, AC amps, AC voltage, AC output data, AC voltage, AC amps, battery data. Solar charger can tell you PV voltage, PV current, and so on. So you can decide which ones you want to select by clicking on them and putting them up in the menu. It will also show you the list of connected devices. And it gives you much more detailed information on that device. So it not only tells you what device it is, what firmware version it's running, when the last time it was spoken to, last time it was reset, and so on. This is a tool that you could use for yourself, or if you're an installer. When it comes to troubleshooting, it can sometimes be helpful to know what version of firmware is being run in the system, because sometimes there can be compatibility issues. Some things work with some firmware and not with others. And this allows you to at least know what firmware is being run by your customer, or if it's your system, architects can take a look and see what the issue is. But you can also search the devices on there and see if there is newer firmware available. If there is, it gives you the option of changing that firmware remotely. A couple of things to keep in mind when you're doing firmware remotely. One is that oftentimes the device has to be reset, meaning it has to turn itself off and back on again. So there's going to be some interruption of service. So it's important to warn your customer or be aware that it's going to happen when you do that. The other thing is, when it comes to inverter chargers, the settings in the inverter charger get reset to factory defaults when you do a firmware update. So it's important, before you do the firmware update, is that you download your settings from your inverter charger, save them, and then when you do the firmware update, you can reload those settings into the device. Is that you've set up this VRM portal, it's giving information from your system, it's being displayed in graphs, and you can go through the timeline. What we saw there was a list of graphs for the past 7 days, but that timeline could be expanded to the last 6 months, the last year if you want. You can shrink it down to what happened in the last 24 hours, or even finer than that. And the nice part about it is all the different graphs that are on there, they all shrink and grow together as your time frame changes. So if you're on dash, if you're advanced. So if I want to change this to the last 4 weeks, all of these other ones will also expand to 4 weeks as well. So it makes it easy to line up events at the same time frame and to look at larger pictures or more detailed pictures of your system. The other thing you can do is that you can share this system with other people. If you want someone, say a technician, to have access to this so they can review this, you can send them an invitation, and that can be review only, or they can make setting changes like changing widgets or like changing firmware if you want them to. So you have some choice as to their level of activity.
So is the data localized, or is the data on your server for the history?
The data is being sent to the server.
To the servers.
The Cerbo itself has got 48 hours worth of data storage on it.
Okay.
If you want to extend that amount, you can put in a micro SD card or a USB stick, and it can store, I think, upwards of 3 years of data, even on a relatively small micro SD card. There's a couple different ways you can use that capability. One, if you have intermittent internet connectivity, and say you want to be uploading data to the VRM portal, but you go through a patch of area that doesn't have internet connection or cellular service, the data gets stored, and as soon as it gets back into a service again, it'll upload the data. You can have the data completely not connected directly to the internet. You can store everything on the micro SD card, and then when you're done with your trip, you can take out the micro SD card, put it in your laptop, and upload it to the VRM portal, and then access the data that way. So there's different ways of managing your data usage and how that information gets up there. But yeah, there are different options for storage and different options for how much information you want to keep.
Are there any alarms? Like suddenly your battery drops down at 10 volts and,
Yep.
middle of the night.
Yep. So in this menu, you can also set up who receives notifications.
Oh, okay. So,
So
in your phone.
by default, it's going to be your account because you have you signed in with your email address, and it'll send you a varying degree of notifications. One, you can set it to the strictest one, which is only send me something if there's an alarm or if something is shut down, like due to low battery voltage or due to inverter overload or the generator failed to start or something like that.
Because sometimes you're out, no internet around, and you're out off grid somewhere in the boonies. So I guess it's just when your phone walks into your. Well, why would you have your phone on? I just wonder if there's a physical alarm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This one,
Without.
the Cerbo, if you go into any alarm mode, it will start to beep,
Oh, so
and
that'd
it will be displayed on this screen as soon as an alarm comes up. However, if you're connecting wirelessly, you have to log into it. You'll see that your Cerbo is beeping, and you'll go, "Why is that beeping?" And you have to log in to get it. If you have it connected to the internet, it will send you an email saying the reason why the system's down.
Sure.
So it'll say, danger, you got a low battery voltage or your inverter overloaded. You can also have those emails sent to whoever you want. So if you have a technician or someone that's looking after your system and you're away, and you say, all right, well, you get the alarms, so if your batteries go low, someone can go take a look at it.
Does it do text as well?
What's that?
Text messages too?
SMS?
Not directly, but you can,
Through the email?
Okay.
yeah, you can set it up through your cellular provider
Okay.
to receive an email that will go to text.
Yeah.
I think AT&T or Verizon has that
Sure.
option. I'm sure they all have something.
Special email address, yeah.
Yeah. So you get notified that something's gone wrong, your tech gets notified that something's gone wrong, and then you can take some kind of action to it. There's also logs of what's happened in the system, so if you want to go back and see any error that's happened over the course of time and look for patterns, you certainly can. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. So this gives you the ability to not only see your system performance over the course of time, it allows you remote access to it, remote firmware updates, and remote setting changes. If your Cerbo is connected to the internet, you can also use the Victron Connect app to go into the devices that are VE Direct enabled to change settings. There are two ways of using Remote Console. One is called Remote Console over VRM, and one is called Remote Console over LAN. LAN was the first example I gave you, where you're connected to a Wi-Fi network, and your phone is also connected to that Wi-Fi network, and it doesn't matter that that network is not going out to the greater internet. As long as you're on that same network, you can connect. Remote Console means you can be on completely separate networks altogether. As long as you're on the internet, then you can connect. If your Victron Connect app recognizes the Cerbo that it's been connected to before, it can allow you to connect to it through the app and do setting changes within the MPPTs and battery monitors through the VRM portal. Keep in mind, it's not often that you need to make setting changes, because theoretically you've done the setting changes correctly the first time, but anything can happen. And if you've got a really remote situation and you realize that somehow the battery charging voltage is too high or too low, you have the option of being able to go in and doing that remotely. With inverter chargers, you can make those setting changes through the VRM portal itself. You can use a program that we have called VE Configure. You will query the inverter charger through the VRM portal, what its settings are, and it'll send up a file to you. You then open up the program, make the setting changes that you want, and resend it back to the inverter charger. So again, it's not a slightly different way of doing it than with Victron Connect, but you can still, say, change battery voltage settings remotely through the VRM portal. As with anything you're doing remotely, you got to be careful about it because you want to make sure that whoever is on the other end knows about it, and you also want to make sure you're making the correct setting changes. Because theoretically, there may or may not be anyone there to notice that anything's going wrong until you get an alarm. Does that all make sense so far? The connections that we have. We've got as you mentioned, we've got the 4 resistive tank sender inputs. We've got some digital inputs which are just recording whether or not a circuit is open or closed somewhere in your system. And we've also got 4 temperature sensor inputs that are extraneous from the rest of the Victron equipment.
So the equipment already comes with it. Those are 4 additional temperature sensors. Like if I want to do an outside and inside.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, the Victron devices have varying ways of getting battery temperature data to adjust their charging profiles to make it more appropriate for the temperature of the batteries. These are just general temperature inputs. You may happen to use it to measure the temperature of a battery if you want, but you can also use it to measure ambient temperature, temperature inside of a refrigerator, the temperature in a salon, the temperature of whatever you'd like.
Is that a Victron component or is that something third party?
Well, we have a temperature sensor that works with the particular circuitry in it. It's not, if you look on the community forum, it's not a proprietary thing. It just happens to be the type of sensor that's inside of these lugs. These particular ones are designed as a battery temperature sensor. They're the same ones that are used with the inverter chargers and with the Lynx shunt. However, they don't need to be connected to a battery to work. They can work on ambient temperature, body temperature.
Water tank, anything you want.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, gosh, if you have a sick kid while you're camping, you stick it under his tongue.
Yeah, it works. Tell him to stick his tongue right in the
It'll
hole.
vary with each.
Screen bigger. So let's just take this one, which I have set up as a fuel tank now. There's things you can do. If you go to the setup of the device, see, first you're going to tell it, what's the capacity of the tank that you're measuring. Whether it's a standard uniform tank or a custom size tank, you can tell it what is the resistive value of this when the tank is completely empty, and what is the resistive value when the tank is completely full. The sender that you have may have that already in documentation, it probably does, but a lot of times, based upon the vagaries of installations, it might not be exact. So you can actually fine-tune the settings using this device by changing those sensor values. And because further down, it actually tells you what the sensor value is at any one particular moment. So you can empty the tank, read what that is, put it in as empty, fill the tank, put it in as full. And that way you're not stuck with like 1 or 2 different types of senders that might be off. You can fine tune it very
What if you've got 4 different sensors, the older style, lower quarter,
Yeah, I mean, that could be a little bit more tricky. You might have to, well, I don't know what the input is on those ones exactly, or whether it just gives a resistive value at top and a resistive value at bottom. When the sensor is at a certain level, you can tell it what the percentage of that volume really is. Yeah, so if you have a funnel-shaped tank, or if you have a big L-shaped tank with a small top to it, maybe when the sensor is only halfway up, it's probably 3/4 full, and the remaining top of the L is only another quarter. You can put in set points in here to let it know when it's full. And the more set points you add, the finer the is. You can set the averaging time. As you can imagine, if you're in a moving vehicle, it's going up and down, and if you have too fine, you're going to percentage going up and down. The old gas stations. And they just respond to whether or not a contact on that circuit is open or closed.
Oh,
And it will send an alert or alarm to you based upon the condition of that contact. Some of the standard ones we have are burglar alarm, CO2 alarm. Trying to see which ones I have hooked up here. So basically I just got some push button contactors here. There we go. That are connected to one of the 4 inputs. And this just, by pressing this button, I'm simulating some kind of alarm going off, some kind of relay closing, and you're getting an alert saying, guess what, you've got a burglar alarm or CO2 alarm. You can also do a door alarm, fire alarm, anything that opens or closes. And again, these are customizable. So even though it says burglar alarm as one of the standard options, you can go in, set up the device. Change the polarity, whether it's open or closed to send the alarm, whether the alarm is sent or not, or whether you just want to see whether something's happened. Because you might not want to have an alarm every 5 seconds of someone going inside and outside the door. And you get the device. In this case, I've chosen the standard burglar alarm, but then here you can put in a custom name. It can be anything you want. Getting a sense of from these 2 ones, you can do the same thing with temperature sensor inputs. So again, there's 4 of them. The one that I've hooked up, that you can see dangling from the bottom there, I've just designated as toaster, just as an example of something that you might want to know the temperature of. So this sensor very easily just plugs in. Again, there's a positive and negative connection to it of the polarity. And when you're connected to it with some kind of temperature value, you'll slowly start to see this rise.
It's going down. It must be cold. You're not warm enough.
Probably, but the standard in here.
Go hands.
We got these hand warmers here. Want one of these?
No, I'm okay. Just move.
Oh, you got 1 Celsius.
I think Celsius is bigger than Fahrenheit.
Yeah, so it's a big of a jump. As you can, again, this isn't for something that you want to have instantaneous temperature readings. You can see there's a little bit of time delay to it. But for something like room temperature or refrigerator temperature, it's something that you can easily use for your own purposes. Instead of being the device that sends that information out to the network, it'll be one that can take that information from the network and will display on this screen and on the VRM portal.
So is that versus you have a CAN port on that, or
Yeah, the VE Can port.
is that an extra unused port that you can plug into your host system, or is it just part of your CAN bus for your own devices? And just
Yeah, it'd be part of your. It would be the way that you would connect this via CAN bus to a greater CAN bus network. It would get it off that same sort of information backbone. So it's the same connection. It's just that it's able to, if it has something to give to the network, it'll give it. But if it sees something that it recognizes on the network, it'll take it and display it. And type senders.
The host system CAN network.
Yeah.
Because I know you guys have a CAN network too, and that's what I was trying to make sure I was hearing. So otherwise, there's like a daisy chain.
Yep.
So he's asking, is there 2 CAN networks available on there, or are you going to connect the Victron stuff to the same CAN bus as everything else in your coach?
Yes, there are 2 CAN bus networks on there. If it works within the same baud rate as this does, which it should, you can adjust one of the outputs to that. We have a CAN bus that's generally used for VE Can, and we have one that's generally used for battery, closed loop battery systems, but they're really the same thing. It just depends on what settings you have them on. And we find that
these values do feed the CAN bus and host system, the different PGMs that are part of the Victron
Oh, I see.
ecosystem.
I see MQTT there. I was going to ask about that too.
Score.
Yeah, I'm a little weak on that one, but I know that that is one of the things you can enable for integration of other systems.
All right, happy dance.
Yeah, so you can use the CAN bus profile. You can enable NMEA 2000 out, which means that it's taking the Victron data, translating it to NMEA 2000, and sending it out on there. And on the other date, you can also do I guess this one is fixed for the baud rate you can use.
That didn't have.
That's probably more than Victron kind of communication goods.
It didn't have the output choice on it.
Yeah, so you have one connection to push it out.
Which is really, this is gathering data from all the devices. You know, it's CAN bus, and then it's a control bit, but the general host system.
But again, once it's connected to that CAN bus on the VE Can, if it recognizes a PGM on that other network that it is programmed to recognize and display,
It'll take that too.
it can take that too.
So we could daisy chain a line from your host CAN bus into that chain as well, is what you're saying. Or does it actually come from the other port? I'm sorry if I'm confusing.
No, well, theoretically it's all on the same network, unless it's only, at this point, a manual operation. So, again, if I'm either standing in front of this device or if I'm 2,000 miles away, I can activate Relay 2 using remote console. If you're using Modbus, you can send a command to operate Relay 2. That is one of the things available now, but for standard user interface, you can do it manually. Relay 1, you can have it manual. You can have it operate as an alarm relay, meaning anything goes wrong in the system, it will activate the relay. It can be a tank pump, meaning depending on the level of the tanks that's being measured, you can have it turn on a pump to transfer whatever you want from one tank to the other, pump out a tank when it gets full. The most common one is to use the generator as generator start stop. One of the ways it can activate if you want it to is by manual start. Some people might want to have that activated, some people might not. You can choose whether you want it to be just manually activated or whether you want it to be auto activated. But the important thing is to go to settings and give it the options of why it's going to start. And that's what you find under conditions. So, these are some of the conditions. You can select that without confusing things too much. If you have a Quattro inverter charger that has two AC inputs, you can tell it if there's AC power on input 1, then don't start the generator because you already have access to AC power. You can start the generator based upon battery state of charge, battery current, battery voltage, AC load. If the inverter is about to shut down due to high temperature, it's about to shut down overload. You can also set it up to run at the exact same time at certain intervals. The important part about the generator start stop is this thing is really flexible, and I think it's really cool. However, the generator has to be able to operate based upon a relay closing and a relay opening. So it has to have its own auto start sequence that it can initiate. I was just talking to Mitchell here about he's found some third-party devices that you can retrofit on generators that don't have this that will allow it to operate based upon the relay source. There's really puts it the same. So out of the 12 different options for tank level digital inputs and temperature, the ability to make these setting changes here. Yeah, and this has lots of ramifications to it, but you'll see when I activate this is what comes up. So basically what the VCC does is it allows the Cerbo to be the information sharer of the rest of the system. So if you have, we're assuming we have an all Victron system here, so Victron charge controllers, Victron inverter charger, Victron battery monitors. If you say limit charge current, you can set a system charge maximum. So say you have a 120 amp inverter charger and you've got a 100/50 solar charge controller, and you want to limit the maximum charge current to 100 amps, let's just say. You can limit that, and the Cerbo will always be looking at what the solar charger is doing. And it's going to keep the batteries from being charged above that maximum level. It's going to prioritize solar charging and only use from the grid what is needed to make up the difference. So if you've got a 50 amp solar charger and it's charging at 50 amps, it's going to tell the Multiplus to only charge at, 50 amps. And then if that backs off to 25 amps due to sun or clouds, then it will allow the Multiplus to ramp up to 75 amps of charging. So it's a good way to coordinate what's going into the batteries and to allow a safe maximum charging amperage while also prioritizing solar. You can also, you can share voltage sense. As you all know that when you have DC cabling in a system, sometimes it can be too small, sometimes there can be really long runs. You can get a voltage drop between where the charge source is happening and what's actually reaching the batteries. If you have these devices connected to the Cerbo, they will use the best information that they have as to what the voltage is at the batteries. The MPPT only knows what voltage is at its battery terminals. The BMV, however, knows what the voltage is exactly at the battery terminal. So it'll tell the MPPT through the Cerbo, well, you may think you're at 14.2 now, but you're not. You're only at 14.0. So you better boost up your voltage in order to get the voltage up to the right level. Similar with temperature. Some of these devices have very simple temperature sensors you can use. Other ones, you may only want to have one temperature sensor on there, and say it's going to the inverter charger. The inverter charger will share that temperature info with the rest of the devices. So the MPPT will know exactly what the temperature of the batteries is and will adjust its output voltage accordingly.
So it sounds like in addition to the hub,
If this dot goes outside of that defined range, you'll get an alarm saying, warning, you've gone too far.
Rented my camper to the wrong person.
Yeah, exactly. And people that have some fleets of RVs have used this. A bunch of golf courses use this on their golf carts in case someone tries to drive off with them. There's been an ice cream vendor that was using this because they had a dozen different ice cream carts and they were hiring people to push them along the streets and sell, and they wanted to keep track of where they were itself. The one thing that should be said is that this only sends Victron data. So it's only going to send information from the Cerbo to the VRM portal. If you want cellular modem capabilities for other devices, for streaming or for that stuff, you would need to get like a provider's hotspot or whatever, and use that on top of the Victron data. But this is a fairly reasonable way to get that remote connectivity going. Between the inverter and the batteries, each little set of connections adds resistance to the entire circuit. Battery cable length adds resistance. Every time you have resistance in it, it makes it harder and harder for the inverter to pull power from the batteries when it wants to create an AC sine wave. When it's creating an AC sine wave, its sine wave is 60 cycles per second. So the inverter is actually pulling for half that sine wave from the batteries, and it's pulling on the negative side of that sine wave for the batteries. So what you'll find is that there's a 120 cycle setup on the batteries, where the voltage of the batteries is slowly dropping at 120 cycles. And the worse the cabling is, the lower that voltage drop is every time the inverter tries to pull power to create that sine wave. And that sets up what's called ripple voltage. And ripple voltage is a good way to destroy an inverter relatively quickly. These FETs are trying to create a perfect sine wave. They have capacitors in them which will smooth out any anomalies in the output or on the DC input. However, the higher the ripple voltage is, the harder it is for the FETs to create a clean sine wave, and it will start to overheat. At about 1.2 volts on a 12 volt system, that's when we'll give a warning saying, be careful, the ripple voltage is getting too high. And at 1.5 volts, it'll shut down. The way you can test it, whether your system has this problem or not, is you can set your AC meter, your digital multimeter, to AC and measure across the posts. And you'll measure a voltage there, and it'll be some value. It's never going to be perfect, 0. It might be somewhere, 0.3 or 0.5. Once it starts getting up around 1 and over 1, you might want to start considering looking at some of the configuration. The other thing that it does is that these batteries are not just connected to the inverter charger, they're connected to every other piece of DC equipment in your system, and other equipment can really hate having that voltage on there. It can really harm some stuff. So measure that ripple voltage. If you're using the Victron, the VE Configure programming tool, it has a little graph when you're connected to a live device that shows ripple voltage, and you can watch it as you turn on heavier and heavier inverter loads. You can watch that ripple voltage start to rise and rise. It's another way to tell whether you have that issue in your system. If you find that that's an issue, the thing to fix is to either increase the diameter of the cables that you have, or to shorten the length if possible, or to reduce the number of connections that are in there. A lot of times that ripple can come from a loose connection or a dirty connection in the DC system. And anytime that happens, that connection is going to be really hot. If you're running current through it, that connection will be hot. And you can also use a thermal imaging camera and search the system. And if you find one connection that's really hot, you'll know that's the one that has the problem. Things you can do with dip switches on these. By far, you can do the most with the Victron Connect software and VE Configure software. So we definitely recommend using that. But if you're in a pinch, if you look in the manual, you can see what these dip switch settings can do. It basically will change your input current limit to certain fixed values. I think maybe you've got 3 choices there, and it'll change your absorption voltage target. I think you have 3 or 4 choices for that. The birds.
Jeez.
To one of these orange. This is the actual relay itself, and these are the contactors that actually open and close. You can use those to signal other devices in the system based upon battery voltage, battery state of charge, inverter output wattage. You have to kind of think of different ways you can use that to your advantage if you want that relay to open and close based upon certain battery conditions or inverter conditions. But again, by default, it's a alarm relay. So if there's an alarm in the system, it's going to activate that relay. There's a normally open, normally closed, and common. So you have to be careful when you're wiring it that you're using the right side so that you're making or breaking the contact when you want it to happen, and not doing it the exact opposite. So I've seen that as a mistake on occasion, where the logic that's been programmed in is perfectly fine. It's just that someone accidentally just wired it to the normally open instead of the normally closed. Some other features you can see on here is that the 2000 watt unit has an internal fuse in it on the positive, which you can see here, whereas the 3000s and ups rely on external fusing to protect the internals.
Is there a transfer switch in there?
Well, no, there's not a transfer switch. This is a single Oh, well, there's an input relay. So what it will do is that when you plug into an AC source, the inverter is going to analyze that AC sine wave and frequency. And the cleaner the sine wave is, the quicker that input relay will close and will allow power to pass through to your output side. What it's doing is it's looking at whatever's coming in and it's making the inverter match that 100% exactly. So it's adjusting its own inverter so that it can add power on top of it. Yep.
So they're the size of like D4s, right?
4Ds, right?
I think they are. Because it came from millimeters. Look at my house batteries, dude. Blood golden.
Yeah, it ain't no joke.
Heavy.
Those bad boys are no joke.
$1,000 right there, that's about, huh? Ooh.
Yeah, sealed.
Yeah, the angels sing when you open the
with
box
handles.
there, right?
Yeah, this is the nice part.
Yeah,
That's gonna help you a lot.
Yeah, it is. Yep. Yeah, I'm gonna have